one clear sign of a civilization in decline is that they begin to block their trade routes. They begin to end trade. Sometimes they do it because they just don't like that tension, the change that comes from this. The Ming dynasty in China being the most dramatic example in history, I think, which basically banned international trade.
Is the West's dominant golden age at an end? What can the past tell us about the future? Joining today is Johan Norberg, who poses these and many more questions in his fascinating book, Peak Human. Coming up, a conversation with Tessa Dunlop, which took place at the Imperial War Museum earlier this month, and our final submarine movie with Roger Moorhouse and Tim Hewitt. Is Das Boot? But until then, it's me talking with Johan Norberg on Peak Human. Johan, great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Johan, I was really keen to speak to you about your book, Peak Human, What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages. And reading the book, it's been a real pleasure. And there is a little endorsement on the front cover that says you're a prophet of anti-pessimism. And so that makes me happy because I'm very much an optimist. And as I read the last page, it does end on a note of optimism. But my first question really was I feel like, and I'm not the only one, that we have been living in a golden age, but that it's coming to an end. And I know you refer to it in the book, but I wondered, am I being a little bit too pessimistic? Are we at the end of a golden age?
I agree with the sense that we can see some of the worrying signs, some of the horsemen of the apocalypse on the horizon. I guess my note of optimism would be that in many of the golden eras, they were present for a very long time. Many of the crises, disasters, they were there for a very long time, but somehow civilizations managed to pull through or muddle through. And I think we do have some strength left in this golden age, in this civilization. And we might just be able to do it this time around.
And do you think then that will continue to be led by, because the final chapter of your book is on the Anglospheres, because you select various civilizations that have had golden ages that have been so influential on the following, I guess, civilizations. But as the Anglosphere is the one to continue it, then not maybe other countries.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess that depends on what Anglosphere countries decide to do in the future. For the moment, it seems like America is not that interested in upholding the American-led world order when it comes to everything from the global trading system to some of the predictability in military alliances and so forth. But I do think that there are so many countries that have grown up and flourished in this era, especially after the Second World War, in Europe, in the East Asian democracies, trading nations in Latin America and so on, who know that this kind of world order is in their interest. And I do think that if they chose to, they do have it in them to uphold some of that, even while America might drop out for a while.
Yes. So I guess I took from the last pages of your book that there will need to be cooperation, really, whereas I guess in the past there have been more isolated civilizations who have had to grasp the mantle. And is history against us here in that there isn't a huge amount of cooperation that's happened throughout, if we look at all of history?
No, that's right. That really, this golden era that we're in right now, and I really think there is one, since the rise of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of liberal democracy, it has meant the greatest improvement in living standards, in social and economic progress that mankind has ever seen. And what sets that apart from historical golden ages is that it has not been limited to a particular region. I mean, once upon a time when Rome fell or Baghdad fell, that was really the end of civilization. People had to rediscover all the knowledge, the insights, and the technologies that they had. This time around, we have eggs in more baskets around the world. There are more. We have, in a way, a global civilization, not in terms of values, but at least in access to knowledge, in access to technology. And that, I think, it's a great thing, because it means that we won't lose civilization this time around, unless we end up in a sort of nuclear apocalypse. There will always be places that will carry on. But the bad thing, of course, is that it's more difficult to coordinate all of these different polities and then come to some kind of agreement on which rules to play by. So it's both great and a little bit problematic.
And there was an element, I guess, with each civilization. Certainly, you start with Athens. Rome has an element of democracy. Athens is founded on the golden age of Athens is founded on democracy. Do you think a democratic element is necessary?
Yes, with the reservation that an aspect does a lot of heavy lifting in that concept of an aspect of democracy, because none of these civilizations were democratic in the modern sense. Not even Athens, with women and slaves excluded. Slavery itself, of course, being an exception to democracy. Rome, the Dutch Republic, and so on, they had these balancing institutions, republics, guilds with a lot of power, but they were oligarchies more than democracies, really power to the wealthiest. But they all contained some sort of limit on the arbitrary power of the ruler. Even, when Rome became an empire, even China under the Song dynasty, they had some idea of a law of individual rights that even the emperor should accept and consider himself limited to, even of course sometimes you reminded him of that at your own peril, because he did have the strength of arms after all, but something that limited the ability of one unlimited ruler to wake up one morning and ruin it all. That seems to be necessary in order to keep these golden ages going, to make them more sustainable in the long run.
One thing I wanted to ask you really was that, and I think this is a real theme running through the book, is, and there's a quote, a great quote from the journalist Norman Cousins, that history is a vast early warning system. And I mean, this is something that I think gets to the heart of the rise in interest in history. I think, well, certainly the rise in history podcasts. The rest is history is this sort of phenomenon, although I don't like to mention it too much on this show. That history, is that how you view history yourself, really, as a kind of, this is a great indicator for for what we're living through now and what can come in the future?
Yes, I think at least that's how I rationalized my obsession with history. I don't know how it started. It could be just an interest in great stories, but the value that I think it has to most people, and one reason why we turn to it in times of trouble, is that we've seen lots of this before. You become less shocked and surprised by strange events if you've studied history, because then you realize that we've been through many of these things before. It might not be history that repeats itself, but human nature certainly does. And many of these aspects, from short-sightedness to greed to our worrying tendency to deal with a dangerous world by trying to isolate ourselves from it and thereby losing access to some of the ideas and solutions that could have helped us deal with it. I think that keeps recurring in history. And that's why history is an early warning system, because it reminds us of certain things we should avoid. Even though we should also remember that history is not just crime and stupidity. Also, some great achievements have been done historically, and we can learn some of that as well, some from that.
Well, yes, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine a few months ago where he was very worried about artificial intelligence and, you know, AI. I think he was getting at, I suppose, the sort of Armageddon type scenario where, you know, we all end up in the Matrix and the computers rule us. But I was trying to get across the point to him that there were revolutionary technologies in the past. For example, I think I picked the printing press, which it was revolutionary, but there was also, I think, it resulted in a lot of religious wars and millions of deaths. So, I mean, it's on the one hand, yes, what has always come to pass as you know, we're dealing with it all. This is nothing particularly new. But that's true, but only so far, isn't it? There are always negative consequences for technological innovation.
That's right. Who was that who said that? Wasn't it one? Someone looked at the history of the printing press saying, it is the best thing that has ever happened to mankind, or the worst thing. And I can never remember which one, because obviously some of the worries about the printing press, that some of the great thinkers thought that this would be the end of learning, because people wouldn't remember things, they wouldn't write it by hand, and they would just get cheap stuff printed nowadays. That was all false. On the other hand, the very democratization of learning meant that we saw many rebel movements in certain regions suddenly, including the Martin Luther, suddenly being able to have access to mass communication of his messages, and we ended up in religious wars. So technology has both great potential and some worrying aspect, and that goes, I assume, for AI as well. But I would say this: it's not the end of learning. It's not the end of human capacity. It's not the start of the matrix, because if there's one constant in history, is that we keep on finding ways of using technology as an extension of ourselves rather than being slaves to it, finding ways in which our creativity can work in synchronization with that new technology, even though obviously great new inventions will also be used by bad people wanting to use it for bad purposes. So but if you can't beat them, join them and use the technology yourself, I guess.
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, I know your chapter on the Renaissance, Italy's very interesting, and that always, I always am thinking of that quote in The Third Man, where Orson Welles is on he's on the wheel in Vienna and compares Renaissance Italy with Switzerland. It is, I guess. I guess tumultuousness is inevitable with humanity's capacity to innovate and I guess grow, enhance itself.
I guess. I think, I mean, The Third Man is a great movie, and Orson Welles' monologue there is also fantastic, and it sticks in your mind because it seems so worrying that somehow the Renaissance was a result of all the intrigue and the conflicts between the Italian city-states, and specifically the Borgias and all their warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed resulted in the Renaissance. I think there are some problems with that monologue. I don't think it's the warfare as such that helped to unleash the Renaissance. On the contrary, you might make an argument. And I'm trying to do that in the book, that when the Borgias really unleashed the Italian wars, that was more like the end of the Renaissance than the start of it. But there is something to be said, I think, for this kind of rivalry between different groups, between different cities and countries, that helps us get out of stagnation. Often the motives are bad. We have to fight against others, but it also means that we have to be more open to the knowledge, the technology of eccentric innovators, artists, and entrepreneurs. Because I think that historically the problem why we've had so few sustainable golden ages is that rulers snuffed them out. Because if you belong to an intellectual, religious, economic elite, why would you ever welcome any kind of change? Because your power might depend on a particular way of producing things, on particular ideas in that society. But if you live in a place like Europe, which during the Renaissance probably had some 500-600 different political entities, independent cities, universities, fiefs, then if you did not accept the new technologies or the new entrepreneurs, your neighbors would, and that would make them more powerful and turn them into more of a threat to yourself. So there is something in that balance. We don't want too much coordination between all these different groups, and so that all the political entities live in harmony with one another, because it might just mean that they end all the innovation, all the dynamic creativity that we also depend on.
I was also interested in the economic areas in the book, and I think the 2008 crash has been quite profound for much of the planet, really. I mean, we've seen stagnant growth, certainly in Europe, ever since. And we're also seeing, and you also mentioned, you give examples of economic, I guess, limitations applied, for example, with tariffs that can really limit growth. And we're seeing the rise of tariffs again, even though we know that they don't work. Do you think that, I mean, I guess Trump is the obvious person in this conversation here. Is this a sort of a means to an end? We're going to get to a no tariff, and I know it's sounding like I'm asking you to predict what Trump's going to do, but
yeah.
But if you were advising him on the past and how to thrive economically, what sort of examples would you give?
First of all, I have to apologize for my cat here. If someone wonders about the strange noises, she's very curious about what we're talking about, and she's not very good at English. So I would advise him to look at how almost all of these civilizations became great originally, because it's very difficult to come up with something that didn't exist in the world before. Everything from new ways of producing iron to books to new philosophical ideas, and most of them came by stealing it from others, by imitation. They saw something different. They were all in one way or another trading civilizations, so they constantly learned from others, and that trade gave them access to the brains, the talents, and the traditions of others. So it gave them more ingredients with which to be creative. So they all depended on trade. And you can also see how one clear sign of a civilization in decline is that they begin to block their trade routes. They begin to end trade. Sometimes they do it because they just don't like that tension, the change that comes from this. The Ming dynasty in China being the most dramatic example in history, I think, which basically banned international trade and introduced a death penalty on those who traded with foreigners and let their world-beating armada rot in harbor in the future, burning the maps so that no one would repeat it, because they wanted stability. They were afraid of this constant change. yes, they got stability and stagnation. So for 500 years, China was in decline. The richest civilization on the planet ended up being one of the poorest. So I would urge Donald Trump to look at the examples of history and both to see where the temptation comes from. Because in times of trouble, when the world seems a dangerous place, you kind of want to stay home. You want to turn from what Thucydides, the Greek historian, talked about, the Athenian mindset of going out there to explore and find something new. You often retreat from that when you're fearful, to the more Spartan mentality of staying at home, trying to protect what you have. But then you rarely protect what you have, because what you have depends on it being rejuvenated, and you constantly find new engines of growth and innovation, and trade certainly helps.
Of the seven civilizations you picked, were there sort of competing number 8, 9, and 10 that didn't quite make the list?
Yes, there were, and there were others that I could have looked at. Everything from other continents. I mean, but different Indian Indus civilizations. You could have pre-Columbian American civilizations in there. I think some European alternatives might make the list as well. But in the end, I had to narrow it down to seven. And when I talk to other historians, and when I talk to economic historians, which ones would you pick? It was easiest to get some sort of consensus that these seven are really, they stand out in history, so they're worth looking at.
Well, the conclusion of the Athenian chapter mentions really the fall, coinciding with the rise of Alexander, and surely, I mean, I have to confess, I'm a huge fan of Alexander. Wouldn't want to be him, but I am eminently impressed by his achievements. And one of one of the areas of achievement that I am most impressed is the spread of Hellenism to the east, which in many ways shares those golden age achievements, and so goes beyond maybe classical Athens to into the sort of Hellenistic era and into the fourth and third centuries.
Yeah, I agree. He's a fascinating character in history. Most difficult job on the planet, probably. So uh, perhaps we wouldn't want to be him or the people he conquered, but he did it in an interesting way. He perfected, I think, some sort of strategic tolerance on his conquests, something that I think the Romans learned from quite a lot. In going into new civilizations, once they were conquered, keeping um, people, especially the elites, there, and learning from their methods and even their religions, and then an intermarriage, sometimes a literal intermarriage between the cultures, obviously, that made it possible then to extend this Hellenistic culture in a new and improved way, because it benefited from learning from the Persian and the Indian civilizations, and the Mesopotamian, and many others, and that's quite an achievement. And then founding cities like Alexandria, that would be important for a very long time afterwards in spreading literacy, these ideas from science to philosophy all around the world. So yeah, I agree. He's fascinating.
Well, I suppose this is something that when the Americans invaded Iraq, by deposing the existing regime and then not having a replacement, they could have been reading more about Alexander because that um, move by the United States is pretty much okay. I mentioned the 2008 crash, but the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan is probably the main marker in a sort of, if not a faltering of moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. One of the those instances that made it reasonable for Americans to think that they've overreached in some kind of hubristic approach to redesigning the world, and then leading to this, the pendulum swings dramatically into more of an isolationist approach. Perhaps we'll see about that. I agree. Trying to redesign the world is always difficult, but if you do it without any knowledge of the culture, without using the local resources, traditions, and people, it's even harder. And it's bound to fail. And this is one area in which history, I think, is really an early warning system. It tells you not to do that. I think one of the greatest approaches, if you want to, and I'm happy to confess that I would want to spread ideas about liberal democracy and rule of law and trade around the world. The way in which to do that is not to say that everything you've ever done here is wrong. Let's do it the American way or the Swedish way. I think the way to do that is to look at that local culture, that local civilization, and how it has, because usually it has in instances, because cultures contain so many different elements, it has probably within it also ideas that are more sympathetic to ideals about openness and rule of law and individual rights. And in different periods, I think most civilizations have expressed that. And to talk about how this is really something within your own tradition that you could emphasize and exploit if you want to prosper too.
Well, Johan, I really have not a huge amount more to ask you, but really beyond... do you remain an optimist for the future? I mentioned at the start that I detected a certain amount of this in the last few pages, but what do you think of the future?
I think that when you study history, two things happen. First of all, you have to become a little bit worried and a little bit cynical about human nature, because you realize the awful things that we sometimes do to each other. But the other thing that happens is that you have to become a bit of an optimist about the world, because we managed to pull through all of these things. That's why we're here today. Our forefathers, they lived through much worse problems and obstacles than we've ever faced. And they managed to not just muddle through, but also to create the richest civilizations in which we lead the longest, healthiest, richest lives with the most access to knowledge and health improvements and technology that we've ever seen. And that's something that makes me hopeful. We've seen that we can, yes, do bad things, but we can also do great things. And with a little help from history, learning from its mistakes, learning from its achievements, I think we are in a better position than ever to deal with these problems, not to neglect the tough challenges that we're facing, but I think that we have something great within us.
Well, that's very well put, and a really nice note for listeners to have to end this on. Johan, thanks so much. Links are in the show notes for the book itself, Peak Human. It's a very nice cover, and it's the listeners will be able to see it, but Atlantic have done a fantastic job. You get the same cover in Sweden?
Yes.
Great.
Well, not the Swedish edition, which will be published in November. They have something different. But I agree, it's an amazing job, and the cover design by Steve Leard is amazing, quite clever, and looks great.
Yeah. Well, Johan, thank you. It just leaves me to thank you for your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.